And so we had heard, had we not, how the young Comtessa's stories, the storyteller's stories had helped the young Contessa, and the storyteller had been telling the stories every day, and with every day the young Contessa grew in strength, she grew in health. Until she could leave her bedroom, she could leave her bed. She was no longer bedridden, she had colour in her cheeks. But over the months that the storyteller was appointed to the court, a longing grew in his heart for his home village. He knew that his stories were rooted in his village. They were rooted in the dust and the dirt of the marketplace where he told them to the children. He knew that they were rooted in the landscape, in the mountains, in the forests. He knew they were rooted in his people. And so he grew increasingly heartsick. But for the growing love that he had for the Contessa, he put this to one side and he continued to tell his stories, and she continued to improve. And over those months, the court alchemist, whose job it had been to treat the young Contessa in the early days of her illness, a cold envy started to grow in his heart. He had tried for many months, for many years, to treat the young Contessa with no success, and yet this storyteller comes in and starts telling her stories, and she starts to improve. This should have been his recognition. The praise should have been praise for the work that he had put in. And so he decided, and he hatched a plan. He retreated to his laboratory, and for many days, for many weeks which turned into months, he would be hidden away. People didn't see him. And weird clanking noises and sounds of machinery would be coming from his laboratory. Eventually, after many months had passed, the court alchemist summoned the Count and requested an audience, which was granted. And so, an audience with the family, with the Count, with the Countess, and with the young Contessa, the alchemist wheeled in a huge, bulky object covered in a massive canvas. And with one great flourish, he pulled off this canvas and declared the marvellous, magnificent storytelling machine. Now this was a cacophony of mahogany. It was clockwork and wires and dials, cogs and wheels, an enormous device. And with a flourish, he took out a key. He placed the key in the side of the machine and he gave it a crank. And the machine started to jerk. He gave it another crank and the machine started to shudder. And on the third crank it burst into life and a voice issued forth from the enormous gramophone horn coming from its top. And this was the story that it told. Many years ago, in a city not so very far from here, there was a young cut purse called Tom. Now, for those of you who don't know what a cut purse is, back in those days, people used to carry their money in a pouch, hanging from their belt. And the cut purse used to make his living by going through the town, sidling up to people, and without them noticing, simply cutting their purse and making off with it. Now, Tom was a very good cut purse. He was an excellent cut purse. He was renowned amongst the profession of cut purses for being the best cut purse in probably the whole of the county. Now one day, when Tom had had a very successful day cut pursing, he was making his way through the streets, decided that he was going to visit one of the taverns, probably have himself a well-earned pint or two of fine ale and a meal. And as he was making his way to the tavern, he happened to bump into this rather gorgeous young lady who bumped it, oh, sorry, and continued on his way. as he continued on his way, he only took a few steps before he realised that there was a slight lightness about his person. The purses he had collected and were hanging around his own belt, he looked down, they had gone. He turned round just in time to see this young lady disappearing down the side street, and so he made chase. As he dashed down the side street, he caught up with her, clapped her on the shoulder, and she turned round and she fell to her knees and begged forgiveness. Now Tom was no fool. He had been cut pursing for many years. He was quite streetwise, so he knew that this was a put on, but he basically said to the young lady, he said, look, stand up, stand up. He said, look, I'm the finest cut purse, known as the finest cut purse throughout the entire county, and yet you, in the blink of an eye, relieved me of every purse hanging from my belt. That's pretty amazing. I think if you and I got together and worked as a team, just think what we could do. Think what we could achieve. As she thought about this, but not for very long, because the idea had its obvious merit, and Tom was quite a good-looking fellow, and Annie, as it turned out to be her name, was a very attractive young lady. They both thought this was a very good deal. And so they started to work together. They plied the streets, and sometimes Tom would distract people in the streets and she would make off with their money, and vice versa. Sometimes she would distract people in the streets and he would make off with their money. But they made a very good living, and they made a comfortable nest for themselves. And over the months of working together, this business relationship turned into something a little bit deeper. They got to know each other, an affection grew between them. And eventually that affection turned into love, and one day Tom turned round and he asked Anne's hand in marriage, and she agreed. They had fallen completely in love. And so they got married. And it was only a matter of a few months before Anne turned round to Tom and said, I have some excellent news to tell you. We're going to have a child. And Tom was deeply excited by this. He said, a child of ours. Imagine with your quickness of eye and my swiftness of hand, our boy would be the finest cut purse, maybe not in just the county, but in the whole country. Anne laughed and said, no, I think you might be right. Yeah, we're good, but our daughter would be excellent. The pregnancy progressed, and obviously, as she got closer to term, Annie had to take a little bit of a back seat in making the money, so Tom went out and he would make the money. But the time came when for the birthing, and Annie was in the room with the midwife, and Tom was sat outside the room pacing up and down nervously, not knowing what to do, as most expectant fathers find themselves in that position, not knowing what to do as you're pacing up and down, wife in the hands of the midwife. And you could hear the noises coming from the other side of the door, quite distressing noises, sound of his wife quite clearly in a lot of pain, and there was screaming and there was shouting, and all of a sudden there was silence, very quickly broken by a high-pitched wail. The midwife opened the door and said, come in, you have an excellently healthy baby boy. Young Tom was delighted. He dashed into his wife, he scooped her up in his arms and gave her a kiss, and he looked down at his son. Had his mother's eyes, but Tom's nose. Beautiful little baby boy. Perfect in every way, as every child is. Apart from Tom noticed there was one oddity. And this oddity was the position of the little boy's hand. It was stuck across his shoulder, across his chest, clenched tight. And it was tight, like that, rigid. And Tom said, is that normal? The midwife said, well, no, I've not ever seen anything quite like it before. I said, well, have you tried to do anything about it? The midwife said, well, I've tried to move it, but it's completely rigid. There's nothing, it just fixed completely tight there. I have no idea. So, well, shouldn't we see somebody? She said, well, I'm sure it'll be absolutely fine, she said. It's, odd things do happen in births, and you just need to give the child, a couple of days just to sort of relax. And so Tom thought, well, okay. He said, if it hasn't changed in a few weeks, we'll call the doctor. But I'm sure everything will be absolutely fine. And so Tom and Annie were very, very happy. And as Annie got recovered, got fitter, and Tom spent time looking after, quite a modern man like that, spent time at home looking after the baby. And Anne would start to go out again cut pursing, and then Anne would stay at home and look after the baby. But this arm, it stayed completely rigid. And they were starting to get quite worried about it. They summoned the doctor, and the doctor said, well, no, it is absolutely rigid. I tried pushing it, but I don't want to force it, because if I force it, I might break something. I don't want to break an elbow or break a joint. I've never seen anything like it. I tell you what, why don't you leave it for a little while, and we'll just see how it goes, see if it improves. Well, Tom was starting to get a little bit fed up with people advising him to leave it, because it didn't seem right, this didn't seem normal. And eventually he said to Annie, why don't we take her to see the old hen wife? The hen wife was like the wise woman who lived beyond the city walls. Old crazy lady that everyone was scared of, but when somebody needed something doing, they would go and see the hen wife. And so Anne agreed, and they wrapped the baby up in swaddling clothes and left the city, and they approached the hen wife's hut, this run-down, dilapidated hut with a hole in the roof for a chimney and smoke drifting out. And the door was slightly ajar, and you could peer in, you could see illumination just from a little fire in the corner and a candle. And so Tom approached the door, and he knocked on the door, and this voice said, come in, come in. And so Tom and Anne, carrying the baby, walked in. And Tom explained to the hen wife what the problem was, that since birth the son's arm had been locked rigid in this position. Lay the baby down on the table, said the hen wife, and she rolled out a sheepskin. And so Annie unwrapped the baby and placed the baby on the sheepskin face up. And the hen wife examined the baby, seemed perfectly normal, very healthy, excellent health in every other respect. And so she reached into her pocket and she pulled out a little watch. And she dangled the watch above the baby's head, and the baby started gurgling and laughing. It was watching the watch, and watching the way that the light danced off the watch. And so she lowered the watch closer. The baby gurgled and laughed more as the light from the fire flickered off the watch and danced off the walls. And she lowered it just a little bit more, and all of a sudden the baby's hand shot out and grabbed the watch. Amazing. Instantly, it was straight back across his chest. But Tom, whose eye was quicker than most of us, noticed that as the hand shot out, something glittering seemed to shoot out from the hand, and his cut purse hand shot out itself and grabbed whatever was flying across the room. And he took it, and he looked at it, and he laughed. And he looked at his wife, and he looked at the midwife, and he said to his wife, our talk about our son being the finest cut person in maybe the whole country, I think may turn out to be correct, he said. What he was clutching all this time was the midwife's own wedding ring. And with that, the storytelling machine ground to a halt. The young Comtessa, again, as she had done when she first heard Jasper, burst into laughter and clapped her hands with delight. This was a novelty, a machine that could tell you stories. And so, while Jasper was still there telling her stories and still there appointed as the court storyteller, more and more often the young girl requested to hear the story from the new machine. The novelty delighted her. To be honest, this didn't disappoint Jasper too much. He was able at least to roam free throughout the city with his own thoughts and go into the countryside and spend time where he enjoyed within nature. And eventually, it got to the point where he requested that he leave and that he go home. The girl was continuing to get healthy, listening to the storytelling machine. Maybe if you looked really closely, she wasn't getting quite as healthy, quite as rapidly. She didn't have quite as much of a spark in her eyes as she had done when she was listening to Jasper's story, but she wanted the novelty of the new storytelling machine. And so, with a slightly heavy heart, the Count agreed to let Jasper go. And he paid him off handsomely. And so Jasper left in a carriage and he returned to his home village. And day after day, the storytelling machine was wheeled into the courtroom or into the Comtesse's bedroom, depending on where she wanted to listen, and it would tell a new story every day. Until one day, mid-story, as the words were spewing forth from the machine, there was a sudden deep twanging noise from deep within inside the mechanism. The machine shuddered and juddered, and those words ground to a halt. The Count instantly clapped his hands and called for the court alchemist, who came running, and he took off a huge panel off the side of the storytelling machine, and he dug into the inside workings. He pulled out cogs, he pulled out springs, and he cleaned, and he polished, and he returned the mechanism back, put it back together again, wound up the key, and again, with its judder and with its shudder, it burst into life, and it continued to tell the story from where it left off. But it was never quite the same. Every now and again, the story would do a little hiccup, or suddenly it would change story halfway through. Occasionally it would repeat itself, or it would repeat words. And then again, whilst they were listening to it, there was another twang from deep inside, and the alchemist removed the panel and he took bits out, he took bits from the mechanism out, took springs out. There were springs in there finer than human hair, which he cleaned meticulously and returned to their precise location. Started it up again, but this time he had to tell the Count that he didn't think that he could keep the machine going if they were going to run it every day the way they'd been running before, and that they could only run the machine once a week, because otherwise it would break down completely. And every week they wheeled the machine out, and most weeks he had to take bits out and clean and polish and put them back in again. And now she was only getting the stories once every week. The Comtesse started to look pale again, and she started to get weaker. And eventually, this had gone on for a couple of months, and she was spending more and more days in bed, increasingly unwell. And with a heavy heart, the Count realised the only thing he could do was to send again for the storyteller. And so he summoned the serving girl, he summoned the manservant, and he begged them to return to the serving girl's village and to ask the storyteller, to beg the storyteller to return to court with them. And so they rode out. They rode out in the carriage, many days journey across barren plains, across mountains, across rivers, through forests, until eventually they arrived at the serving girl's home village. And they rode into the village, and there, again, as before, was the storyteller, in the dirt, in the dust, surrounded by the children, whose faces were just looking up at him, completely transfixed. The serving girl and the manservant got down from the carriage, and they approached Jasper, and as they approached him, they could hear his words. And again, he was telling his stories to the children. The story he was telling them was a story of three brothers. And not three brothers, they were three friends. It's quite important. These three friends, they were young men. They'd grown up in the village together, they had played together, and they had decided that the time had come in their lives that they needed to go forth, they needed to seek their own fortunes, make their own way in life. But before they did that, they wanted to earn a little bit of money to prepare them so that they didn't go out with nothing. And the three of them worked together on a farm for an old lady that they knew well. You know, she'd known them since they were knee-high to a grasshopper. And this old lady said, you know, she was not a wealthy old lady, but she had said to them that if they work on the lambs for her, work on the sheep, looking after the sheep over the winter, keeping them alive, then come the spring, lambing season, each one of them can have one lamb, a pick of any of the lambs that they wanted. And they thought this was a fair deal because they could then take that lamb and they could take it to market and they would get a fair price for it. So that's what they did. They worked over the winter period and they kept the sheep alive, and the lambing season came and the sheep gave birth, and they were ready to pick their choice of lambs from those that had been born, but a strange miracle had occurred, a wonder that had been unheard of. One of the lambs had been born with a completely pure golden fleece. The old woman said, I'll keep my part of the bargain. You may have your pick of the lambs, but you're going to have to work out amongst you which one of you is going to have the golden lamb. Well, the three friends chatted amongst themselves, discussed this, and the oldest one said, well, I should have it, obviously. I'm older than you. By seniority, the lamb should be mine. Well, the middle one said, yeah, but I'm cleverer than you. I'm the cleverest of the three of us, and I should have it because I would be able to work out what to do with it and to maximise the profit that I could make from it. And the youngest one said, but I have my mother is at home and she's old and she's infirm, and when I leave, I need to make sure that she's going to be well cared for. So I should have it so that I can ensure that she has a goodly amount of money in her purse and can pay for whatever care she needs. Well, this went backwards and forwards. The three friends discussed this for a little while and eventually said, look, we're not going to work this out between us. We're going to have to go and ask the king, the senior authority in the land. And so we went to the palace and they asked for an audience with the king, which they were granted. And they explained their problem to the king. And the king said to them, he said, okay, what I ask three of you, each one of you in turn, if you had the money from the golden lamb, what exactly would you do with it? Well, the oldest one said, well, I want to become a soldier. I want to fight in your army. But if I had the money from the golden lamb, he said, I'd be able to put myself through college and I would be able to join as an officer higher up the ranks and I'd be able to serve you better that way. And the king nodded, said, military service, it's an honourable thing, it's an honourable profession. And he turned to the middle one. He said, what about you? What would you do? He said, well, I would become a merchant. He said, I would take the money from the golden lamb. He said, I would buy goods and I would travel to foreign lands and I would sell those goods for more than I paid for them. And then I'd be able to buy exotic goods in these foreign lands. I'd bring them back and I'd be able to sell them for more than I paid for them. And backwards and forwards and so forth until I'd made myself a wealthy man. The king said, well, yeah, that's certainly a very fine and noble profession, a merchant. The kingdom needs more merchants, just as the kingdom needs more soldiers. And he turned to the youngest and said, well, what about you? What would you do with the money? The youngest man said, I wish to enter the priesthood. It's been my vocation all my life, but my mother is unwell and I'm her only son. And if I leave, she'll have nowhere to care for her. So I would use the money to ensure that my mother could be cared for and looked after. And the priesthood, yes, it is another noble profession. He said, I'm finding this difficult. I find it difficult to choose between the three of you. Which one of you should get the golden lamb? He said, but you're obviously all very good at talking. So what I would like you to do is I would like each one of you to tell me and to tell everybody here a story. And we will judge on the merit of the stories that you tell who will get the golden lamb. Absolutely fine. The oldest one stepped forward first without a hesitation. And he told such a story. He told a story of hearts broken, of love lost and love regained. And as he spun his words, everybody in the audience felt the pain of their first love and their first heartbreak. And tears were rolling down people's cheeks until he reached the end of his story when the parted lovers were reunited and everybody just felt a warm glow deep within their hearts. That was indeed an excellent story, said the king. And the middle of the three boys stepped forward, and he told a completely different story. His words wove a tale of adventure and of daring and of quests and knights overcoming desperate obstacles and eventually winning their goals. And as his story ended, everybody in the audience, their heart was racing. And the king took a moment to catch his breath and he said, that too was indeed an excellent story. And then the youngest boy stepped forward and he told a story of intrigue, of spies, of deceit and of discovery. And when he had finished, everybody just applauded. And the king looked at the three of them and he said, "Now, I've made my mind up." He said, "I will give you what it is you need. You need to wait here for a minute." And the king left with his courtiers. And he left them waiting there for a short while. And when he returned, there were three courtiers with him, and they were each carrying a set of bare robes, a pair of sandals, a loaf of bread, and a flagon. And the king took the first pile off one of the courtiers, and he walked to the first brother, and he said, first friend, and he said, this is for you. He took the second one, to the second friend, and he said, "This is for you." And he gave the third one to the third friend. They were slightly perplexed about this because the value of the robes and the sandals and the hunk of bread was by no means, not even a third of the value that one could expect to get through a miracle like a golden lamb. They were a little bit nervous of saying it. I mean, this was the king. But eventually, the oldest one said, "Excuse me, sir, but we thought that you were going to make a decision as to which one of us would get the golden lamb." The king said, "If I gave you the golden lamb, you'd become a soldier. We need soldiers. But if I gave him the golden lamb, he would become a merchant. And if I gave him the golden lamb, he would become a priest." What we have heard today are three of the finest stories that any of us have ever heard. For you to become a soldier would be an utter waste. For you to become a merchant and for you to become a priest would be a complete waste of your talents and skills. What we need are storytellers. So these robes, these sandals, they are for you to go forth into the world, into the country, to gather stories from the people that you meet and to share those stories where you next travel on to. And that way you will learn more stories, you will tell more stories, and all those stories will be shared. And so this is what the three young men did. And as they left the court, they were applauded by everybody. And people pressed coins into their hands. And as they went forth into the world, they found that with the stories that they gathered and the stories that they shared and the stories that they told, that they were welcomed into people's homes. They were granted hospitality. People gave them what little they could. Sometimes it was very poor, but they made a living as they moved from village to village, from town to town, telling and sharing their stories. And they realised that the love that they generated and the hospitality that they received were themselves riches far, far greater than that they could have acquired from the golden lamb. And so Jasper finished up his story. And the serving girl approached him and explained the Comtesse's plight. She explained how Erica had started to become ill again, that the machine had become broken and its stories were distorted. And she begged Jasper to return with them to the city and to the court. And so Jasper agreed, and he climbed into the carriage, and they rode back through many, many miles again, through the deserts, through the plains, through the mountains, through the forests, until they arrived at the court. But this time Jasper took the manservant and he went straight to the young Comtesse's room. And he instructed the manservant to bring her chair with him. And the manservant placed Erica in her wheelchair, and they wheeled her down to the carriage and placed her in the carriage. And this time they returned to the village, but this time with Erica. When they arrived at the village, Jasper instructed the manservant to place the wheelchair on the ground, which he did, and he wheeled Erica into the centre of the village square, surrounded by the children, and he said to her, "Tell a story." She was thrown, she was panicked. She said, I don't know how to tell a story. You're the one that tells the stories. He said, "No, just trust me, relax, tell a story. You have a story within you." And he explained to her that the reason that she had become unwell, the reason that she had been ailing, was that she had been relying for too many years upon the stories supplied by others. And that in order to be truly well, she needed to discover that story that was within herself and to share that with others. And so haltingly, stumblingly, the Comtesse started to speak. And then her words started to flow more readily. And the story that she told is the story that I've just told you, of a young girl and her need to hear stories in order to be well, and the creation of a magnificent and marvellous storytelling machine, and how, when the storytelling machine broke, she became unwell and eventually discovered her own story. And that was the first time I properly heard this story in full. And the young Comtesse Erica von Strom went on to become one of the greatest storytellers that the land had ever known, one of the greatest teachers and one of the greatest poets. And that, my friends, is the story of the marvellous, magnificent storytelling machine, and how the Comtesse Erica von Strom discovered her own inner story, and through it, her own inner path to healing. Emily, would you like to do